I watched the Akmen's video about Yu-Gi-Oh! And seen other content creators talk about it, and I also wanted to express my thoughts and opinion on the matter because I love Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm going to cover every section that he talked about in his video in a timely manner. I recommend watching the Akmen's video if you haven't already. First off, the introduction was very cool, especially the parody of the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters anime opening. Moving on to card games and you. In a nutshell, he's praising the game for being pretty cool and being pretty dumb at times, and he's not wrong. When going over the absurdity of Yu-Gi-Oh's complexity, he shows the rule book going over chain rules. Now, while it does just boil down to asking your opponent, do you have a response? And resolving things in a metaphorical stack, like the cards were physically stacked on top of each other, and you resolve the cards in the order they were placed on the stack, a term used in Magic the Gathering to easily explain chain rules. But the Ackman isn't necessarily wrong when it comes to complexity of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like just looking at the rule book, it has so many pages and text to read through that like it's just so boring. Especially like if you were a kid trying to like get into the game. Like I think most people didn't read the rule book like when growing up. Like they just watched like the anime, although that caused some problems when you were trying to learn Yu-Gi-Oh! Through like the Duelist like Kingdom arc, but like you have to like kind of consider that like Yu-Gi-Oh! Like as a manga, like it can kind of be like loose with its rules, and like the game kind of played like a tabletop like RPG like Dungeons and Dragons versus like an actual card game with like set rules. And then like, you go on to like Battle City, and then that's where like, people learn more on like how to like actually play the game, and like the rules were like more grounded and stuff, and like matched up with like the rules that like, Konami came up with when like designing the game. And I think there needs to be a simplified version of the rules for beginners to have a basic understanding of the game, like Magic the Gathering had with some of its products in the past. Next, background of Yu Gi Oh! He talks about Season Zero, which is somewhat obscure information in the Yu Gi Oh! Fan base because you either stumble upon it while looking into the Yu Gi Oh! Manga or find a video talking about Season Zero, which isn't common. He talks about how 5Ds is and how ridiculous card games on motorcycle is and how impractical it is, which is true. Like if you're gonna drive at like over like 80 miles per hour or something, like your pieces of paper are gonna like fly off into the distance. Although, if you analyze the symbolism behind card games on motorcycle, I think it represents the game actually speeding up with the introduction of synchro summoning and how much it is easier to pull off and use compared to like fusion and like ritual summon. And then 5Ds is where like Yu-Gi-Oh really started to differentiate itself because it was like loosely based off of like Magic the Gathering. Konami really capitalized on Yu-Gi-Oh's unique mechanic of combining monsters to form a more powerful one in a separate deck from the one you usually use. But this time, like they made it more flexible and like easier to use. That it was like actually used like competitively. Because like the only time like fusion summoning was like used competitively was like with a card called Magical Scientist, which can like summon the fusion summon cards without using like polymerization, the fusion materials itself, forming like magical scientists like FTK and you know other instances. But I just kind of want to like move on, and I think like how Konami like designed synchros was like such a great step like moving forward. In addition to like, kind of like creating archetypes that like synergize with like members of its like archetype and like, just like making them like really good. Like the first competitively viable archetype was Gladiator Beast, which was debut in Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. Next up, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was always flawed. Okay, getting back into Yu-Gi-Oh is like getting a hard slap in the face with all the new summoning methods, more text on every single card on average, both like card and word wise. And we have Nirvana High Paladin being used as the poster child of everything wrong with Yu Gi Oh! This is a little bit over exaggerated, in my opinion. I think it comes from like people don't like synchros, people don't like pendulum, people don't like how cards are bloated with like a bunch of text and paragraphs. And this card embodies all of that. You just like, learn the summoning methods and just like read a card. It's not that hard and it's not that bad. And moving on to like my next topic, pendulum cards. Okay, pendulums is like another overly like exaggerated problem that like some people have with how Yu-Gi-Oh has like changed over time. Like out of all like the summoning method, it's just pendulum. Why pendulum? Because it has not one text box, but two. Okay, just imagine a card that's part monster and part spell, giving you flexibility in how you play the card. It has two separate text boxes because it helps separate the pendulum card spell effect and monster effect. I think pendulum cards are fine, although being able to bring it back if the card is destroyed, as long as you can pendulum summon, is a bit much, especially if you can revive a bunch of monsters with no particular downside. Although I think the design philosophy behind that is so you can always swing back into action and make a comeback. Although Pendulum's revival ability did get nerfed with the introduction of Master Rule 4 and Lake Monsters, and stay that way with Master Rule 5, as you can only revive a Pendulum monster from the extra deck to either the extra monster zone or main monster zones that a Link monster points to. Moving on, Backman moves on to say how complicated the game is with the amount of summoning methods. You got to learn how to play the game, which is valid. But I think anybody can get them given enough time. Although it does make Yu-Gi-Oh like a grind to learn, and it's like can be like very like overwhelming at time, especially like if you put so much like information in front of like a new player. Like it's gonna like scare them off, and then they might want to like just play something else that's like a lot more simpler, like Pokemon. Pokemon's like really simple game despite, it like, changing over time and like introducing like a new mechanic here and there. It's like it still stays like relatively simple. Like all the new like Pokemon mechanics like EX, GX, Tag Team, V Star, like they all sort of do like pretty much like the same thing. And there's like text boxes and reminder text of like, hey, what does this mechanic do? Like, oh, you take instead of one price card, two price card or free price card, or oh hey, there's this like super special awesome ability that you can only use like once per turn. And then the Ackman segues to Paul from Team APS, talking about how when you try to like use your old deck in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, like the sad reality is like it ain't gonna work. That's normal with any card game due to like power creep and how cards get better over time. But people get really like attached to their card. Like it just really sucks that like your cards simply aren't that good anymore and hence lose value or could be kind of summed up as like worthless or useless in the face of like new cards. Even if these cards get new support down the line, that those decks still can't compete with other decks in a competitive environment. Now, I like how the Ackman talks about how Yu-Gi-Oh was flawed in the beginning because that's sometimes often glanced over when people talk about like what's wrong with Yu-Gi-Oh today. Like in the beginning, how a bunch of monster cards were complete garbage or useless because it kind of boiled down to having the most attack and how many tributes it took to summon that card. For example, why play Dark Magician when you can just play Summon Skull, who requires one less tribute but the has the same attack stat? An interesting thing to note that I think Summon Skull, like in his earlier depiction, was like level 7. I'm not 100% sure about that. I think like at least in like season 0, he was a lot higher level. I'm not sure about like the original manga. Right. And then there were like monsters with effect, but like they were typically like garbage. Like the only good ones were um like Man Eater Bug, Magician of Fate, like etc. Right? But like both of these problems like get solved over time. Like they focused on monsters with like having effects, so like each one of them is like useful like in their own right, although not all effect monsters had good effects. But still, it became a little bit less about like what monster has like the highest attack value, like the more like the game like progressed. Like having a good like attack stat wasn't everything. Like what can this card do? What was its effect? Etc. Right? And Yu-Gi-Oh really had like a rocky start in the beginning when you kind of like look at like where the game started and you look at like what cards were useful and then how many cards were just like absolute like garbage and like were not worth playing, right? But it's just how Yu-Gi-Oh was in the beginning. But things are different and that's a good thing. Next up, power creep and game mechanics. So Backman did like a bit or skit about legendary fisherman free because he basically has like a bunch of like effects that like prevent it from being like destroyed by card effects or battle. I think like he's unaffected by like spell or traps, right? You know, it's a bit awkward to explain to somebody for the first time that cards that don't say they target cards when activating their effects don't count as targeting a card, despite selecting a target to resolve the effect. This is a really weird technicality and may have been unintentional, but necessary, and became a necessity as a way for cards to get around other cards or remove cards that cannot be targeted by card effects. Now, let's take it another step further when it comes to cards unaffected by other card effects. There is a way to get around them in the form of kaijus. Kaijus are monsters that can be summoned to your opponent's field by tributing one of their monsters. Because you are simply paying for the cost of a card and a card is in the hand, it does not count as targeting a card and using a card effect. Despite like selecting a target to like, resolve the kaiju monster's effect, although it's different. It's a cost, not an effect. Although they kind of feel like they should be the same thing because it's an effect monster. Is it that its effect? Yeah. But I think like cards being unaffected by other cards is a bit absurd and can be frustrating to deal with at times, but is a result of Konami hitting a limit on card design when it came to like giving cards some form of protection. Like, oh, this card can't be destroyed by battle. This card can't be destroyed by like card effects. Oh, this card can't be targeted by card effects. Okay, this card is just unaffected by card effects. Okay, next section. Too much text. Yeah, power creep. Power creep has led to cards having more text on average because slapping a bunch of effects on cards make it better than the old stuff. I think Yu-Gi-Oh's problem is how the text is presented on a card. It's all smushed together and there's no spaces or keywords separating effects. Just take a look at how like Pokemon and like Digimon cards are like designed. Now, I learned this by watching Paul from Team APS, which is a point brought up later in the video, where the OCG has it a little bit better than TCG because effects are like separated and indicated with like little circles with like numbers inside. Like, oh, this has a one, this refers to the one effect. This has a two, this refers to the two effect, etc., etc. Now, I don't necessarily have like a problem with how much text is on a card and reading it because it can be done like relatively quickly, like within a matter of seconds. I just like speed read it or like skim the card a bit. Although it can get a bit annoying at times. And everybody knows Yu-Gi-Oh players often don't read a card because either A, they have played with it or against it multiple times and have an idea of what it does, so they don't bother reading it, or B, that card isn't meta relevant, so they don't care, or C, they just don't care in general. Like maybe they're just waiting for, you know, their opponent's turn to be over and then they get onto their turn and it's like, oh, why should I care about my opponent's card when I'm just gonna like, destroy it or remove it or something. But then they're gonna make the mistake of like when they run into the card they're trying to destroy, and it's like, oh yeah, my card has this effect that like negates stuff. It's like, wait, what? But yeah. Moving on. For a new player or somebody returning to Yu-Gi-Oh, the amount of text on a card can be overwhelming and turn people away from the game. Now, you can't force people to get into Yu-Gi-Oh if they don't want to read the cards, even if it is a pretty easy thing to do. And it's something like Konami cannot like really like fix. I think like the best thing you can do is like maybe try to like introduce a deck that's like very simple and like easy to pick up and stuff. And something that isn't pendulum, right? And the same thing with Yu-Gi-Oh players. You cannot stop them from complaining or not about not wanting to read cards. Next up, card effects and complications. It does really suck when you sit through your opponent's turn without a response, or maybe you burn through your hand traps, and your opponent still keeps on going. With some decks being able to go through 10 plus cards, it can feel like your opponent's playing solitaire, but majority of the games that's not the case. And while it does happen, it is also viewing Yu-Gi-Oh through a vacuum, and not as a whole. It does sour the experience of Yu-Gi-Oh a bit, but you just gotta like, just move on to game two. Or just maybe take a break. Okay. Now, I want to rant a bit about Asian Eyes, White Dragon, or Sladra because he was featured throughout the video. But the point I want to talk about is when he brought up your opponent setting up a bunch of negates and you not being able to play through it and you can't do anything about it, which can happen. But Sladra said something similar in a video he made a couple years ago called Yu-Gi-Oh takes no skill, where he goes on to say that, well, Yu-Gi-Oh takes no skill because of the same exact scenario mentioned earlier, despite there being like hand traps and like board breakers that enable you to do something before and after your opponent sets up a board with a bunch of negates, meaning there is counterplay. Now, while you might not draw these cards, he never mentions them both in his own videos and the Ackman's video. Slager's video is very controversial as he completely dismisses the time, effort, research a person puts into learning and getting better at the game, among other things, despite saying that he is still creating Yu Gi Oh content to this day. I'm not going to say more about it, about him, or go any further than that. Feel free to look more into it if you want to, or to get more context, because that's a whole can of worms I do not want to open up in this video. I don't want to start drama. I'm just stating the facts and letting people know more about this guy if they haven't already because of his actions and attitude towards this game. Now, I assume the Ackman didn't know about Slater's video considering how old it is when asking for Slater's opinion on the game. Now, should you hold somebody accountable for something they did years ago? Yes, because people should be responsible for their actions, but you should also give people a chance and acknowledge that people can change. Based on Slater's word, in Yu Gi Oh! Takes No Skill and the Ackman's video, I don't think he changed. Moving on. Yes, it sucks that one third of the game being traps was considered too slow, but Konami cannot undo power creep, so they design cards that activate in the hand like a trap, so players have a chance to interfere with their opponent's turn going second. Ash Blossom, although it wasn't the first hand trap, was a great card, but I think a huge problem was that in the beginning, due to its high rarity, it being generic, and being a really good card, the card I heard was around $100 per copy in its prime, with Ash being a Freya for any competitive deck. I think if the card was lower rarity, more accessible, or cheaper, maybe people wouldn't complain as much about the card. Now, let's look at like Effect Veiler and DDD Crow. They are really good hand traps, as like the first hand trap was like Karibo, although he wasn't really that useful. Now, going back to Effect Veiler and DDD Crow, um, these cards came before Ash, but after Karibo, but they were more limited in like what they stopped. Effect Veiler, it negated a monster effect, although it was errata, so it can only negate a monster effect on your opponent's turn. And then DD Crow can banish a card in your opponent's graveyard. Now, these cards did not feel like an instant staple in any deck, and although I'm not sure, I think they were probably cheaper than Ash Blossom. And another thing, he complains about like how hand traps are like completely contradictory to like how traps are. Well, I'm not saying completely. Okay, completely is like the wrong word. Okay. Like he I oh yeah, another thing is that I would like to mention was that like the Ackman brought up that like, oh hey, like like if a card's gonna be a trap, it should be like set on the field so that I know that my opponent is laying down a trap. Hence, like the phrase, the card, the design, trap card, right? And it's typically like a common thing that like some you can kind of say Yu-Gi-Oh boomers complain about like modern Yu-Gi-Oh. But the thing is like what really is the difference between like a trap in the hand and trap on the field? Like okay, you can just visually see it on the field instead of the hand, you know? Hand traps are like pretty common. They are typically like 25% of like any deck. I mean, there is the odds of like pretty good odds that your opponent's going to have like a hand trap in their hand. And it's like it's hidden. It's not on the field, but it's like predictable. Like there's a good chance your opponent has like a hand trap in the field. And then when the time comes, you just like cross that bridge when you get there. And let's move on to Demian, the mighty uh, master of magic. I think that was his name. I don't have a picture of it, but I know what it like does. Now, Endymion is another poster child for like cards having too much text or like, oh, this is what's wrong with like modern Yu-Gi-Oh. And yes, Endymion does have a crap ton of effects, you know, as it is like a pendulum monster, but not but some pendulum monsters have definitely more effects than others and stuff. Now, you just gotta like chill, take your time, just read it. It'll probably take just a minute to go over it, although you definitely don't want to show this card to any Yu-Gi-Oh beginner. Wink. Now, moving on to dumb names, dumb archetypes. There was definitely a shift in card design from making generic monsters like, oh, these are zombies and these are dragons, into Madoches, Prank Kids, Ignisters. But I think Yu Gi Oh! Strong point is its archetype in taking almost any concept and making cards based off of it, even if it is a little bit ridiculous. And then we have cards that are just a bunch of adjectives slapped together. Okay, it- that's whatever. I think they are like cool cards. I mean, like Yu-Gi-Oh like is like anime based and stuff, and that's what anime is sometimes. It's like over the top, loud, exaggerated, has a bunch of adjectives. I'm gonna bust out my like Giga Buster dual double X super mega awesome like sword out, you know, or something like that. Next up, opening packs aren't fun because there are a lot of archetype specific cards now compared to how it was in the beginning. Now, it does suck that you can't slap like any card into a deck because it's archetype like restricted, meaning you can't use it unless you're like playing or building that deck. I know that for like personal experience from like opening booster packs when like I was much younger and stuff. But like this is just how like cards are designed. Like they're designed to like synergize with its own archetype and it's locked into it so like the people creating the cards don't have to like worry about this card being applicable in like every deck. Also, you can mix archetypes together. It just depends on like the synergy or sometimes like the consistency like of like a group of cards like oh it can be run as like an engine cards that can boost the consistency or power of a deck but aren't enough to like make up a full deck. For example, there's Alistair the Invoker, the Predaplant engine, Brilliant Fusion, etc, etc. But opening packs when you want to get a generic staple is it fun both in the past and modern Yu-Gi-Oh. Now, in conclusion, I think the Ackman makes a strong point that he doesn't really hate the game. He just points out some flaws with the game, which is his opinion, which you can agree or disagree with. Yu-Gi-Oh being a important part of his childhood and making it better is something I can relate to, as I made friends through Yu-Gi-Oh. It was and it was a fun pastime in school. He mentions how he can choose how he wants to play, which is true. There are multiple ways to play Yu-Gi-Oh and enjoy it. He does admit the video might not have been the most structured video, although I think he does do pretty good dividing up the video into sections, collaborating with various Yugitubers, and was well informed about various aspects of the game. That's all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, goodbye.